JBS presents the Hampton Synagogue's Author Discussion Series with Rabbi Bronstein.
My name is Glenn Dorskin. Welcome to the Hampton Synagogue. The Hampton Synagogue Author Discussion Series is a cultural highlight of our summer season, both for members of our congregation and our many visitors from across the Hamptons. I am proud to serve as series chair, and it is my great pleasure to share our past season with you, our global congregation, in celebration of Jewish Book Month. Please welcome Daniel Schulman.
Hey, good evening.
Good evening.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure to be here.
And it comes almost with an apology because we really should have had you here for Sons of Wichita, which was enjoyable.
Only 9 years too late. That's okay.
Better late than never, exactly. You had told me before that we were going to start tonight with a short reading so we can get a bit of the flavor of the book in your own voice. So why don't you just describe what you're going to be reading for us?
I'm going to read the introduction of a couple pages from the introduction of the book, which is called Salem Fields. And it sets up the main character of this story who, if you don't know him, you should. He's a fellow named Jacob Schiff. September 28, 1920 was supposed to be a joyful day. A Tuesday, it fell during Sukkot, the week-long Jewish harvest festival that follows Yom Kippur. Sukkot was usually a time of revelry and jubilation, singing and feasting, but instead grief and gloom shrouded New York City. The weather itself was unsettled according to the forecast, the air sticky with humidity and rain on the way. Judges adjourned their courts that morning and flags flew at half-staff in the financial district. The streets of the Lower East Side, where crowds typically jostled among a labyrinth of pushcarts, were unnervingly serene. Peddlers covered their wares, merchants locked their shops. Tucked into the windows of closed storefronts and hanging in the entryways of tenements, settlement houses, and orphanages were placards in English and Hebrew reading, "The East Side mourns the loss of Jacob H. Schiff." The banker and philanthropist, head of the formidable Wall Street house of Kuhn Loeb, had died several days earlier. He was a diminutive man. He claimed 5'6" on his passport, though he might have been rounding up generously. But he was a colossus of finance and Jewish life, whom one New York paper described as the foremost world representative of his race. During his lifetime, he had dueled with J.P. Morgan for railroad industry dominance, gone toe-to-toe with U.S. presidents over immigration and foreign policy, and warred with an entire empire on behalf of his oppressed religious brethren. He left the world a vastly different place than it had been when he entered it 73 years earlier in Frankfurt. Perhaps the mourners felt it. They were saying farewell not just to a man, but to an age. Built to accommodate 2,000 worshipers, Temple Emmanuel, the hulking Moorish revival-style synagogue on 43rd Street and 5th Avenue, was filled to capacity. The presidents of the Union Pacific and Pennsylvania Railroads, a mining tycoon and a precious gems magnate, a former ambassador and a future one, the Civil War general who captured Jefferson Davis, the founder of Sears, the publisher of the New York Times. These eminences were just part of the 23-man contingent of honorary pallbearers, which also included one of the most famous New Yorkers of that era, Schiff's Kuhn Loeb partner Otto Kahn. But the most amazing sight was not to be found inside Emmanuel's cavernous sanctuary. Rather, it came into view as Schiff's funeral procession traveled down Fifth Avenue from the banker's mansion near the corner of 78th Street. For block upon block stood thousands of people, many of them poor Jewish immigrants from the East Side who had come to pay their respects, their heads bowed low as Schiff's flower-laden casket passed. After the service, crowd members fell in with the funeral cortege, some of New York's lowliest citizens mixing with some of its loftiest. They marched to the Queensboro Bridge, from which Schiff's casket continued to Salem Fields, the sprawling cemetery that the Emmanuel congregation had established on a vast and gently rolling track that straddled Brooklyn and Queens. Stately mausoleums, some containing stained glass windows by Louis Comfort Tiffany depicting biblical tableaus, speckled the hillsides. Interred within were some of America's greatest financial minds, men Schiff had known well. Jesse and Joseph Seligman, whose prolific sale of U.S. bonds during the Civil War and afterward helped to sustain and strengthen the fragile nation. Marcus Goldman, a trailblazer in the commercial debt market. Emanuel and Meyer Lehman, the commodities trading wonderkins who helped found the New York Cotton Exchange. Schiff's majestic tomb, assembled from 20-ton granite slabs and evoking a Roman temple, overlooked the rest. He was among the last in a line of German Jewish dynasts, and in many ways the most consequential, who played a pivotal part in America's progression into a financial and thus global superpower. Their firms, J&W Seligman and Company, Goldman Sachs, Kuhn Loeb, Lehman Brothers, capitalized railroads and transit systems, utilities and industrial giants, cities and nations. They helped give rise to some of the nation's most iconic companies: B.F. Goodrich, General Motors, Kodak, Macy's, Paramount, Polaroid, Sears, Studebaker, U.S. Rubber, Western Union, Westinghouse, Woolworth, and many others. And that was merely one facet of their seismic influence on the 20th century. He was one of the small but powerful group who have made the higher commercial life of New York City what it is today, one of Schiff's intimates remarked on the day of his funeral. The future historian of American business and industrial affairs must set forth their careers as dominating an epoch which, with all of its faults, had been no less than majestic in its power, its distinction, and its forward movement among the ages.
So before we really get into it, just maybe a word about the title, The Money Kings. I know you discussed it a little bit in the introduction, but where does that phrase come from?
So the Money Kings was basically the term that the pundits and the papers of the Gilded Age would use, not just for Jewish bankers, but for the major moguls of that era. So J.P. Morgan was a money king, John D. Rockefeller was a money king, Jacob Schiff was a money king. But when I started writing this book and I came upon that phrase, I said, wow, that's amazing. This is the book title right then and there. But of course, I thought about it a little more, and I'm like, well, The Money Kings, I'm writing a book about German Jewish bankers. Is this the best title for it? I wondered if I should write this book at all, honestly, because I was afraid that it would reinforce stereotypes about Jews and money. But as I researched the life of Jacob Schiff, I sort of realized that this was an important book to write, because the only people that cared about Jacob Schiff and his legacy were conspiracy theorists who cherry-picked from his biography for their own purposes of furthering anti-Semitism, basically. And so it sort of upset me to think that a person like J.P. Morgan can be a money king, but Jacob Schiff can't be. So that's why this is called The Money Kings.
You know, I was going to ask this a little bit later, but you brought it up now, so I'm going to kind of shift around a little bit. Why do you think that a person of such consequence as Jacob Schiff has never really been treated by a biographer before the way that you're doing right now?
I was just kind of astounded by that myself, because here was just a major historical figure. It's hard to find major financial tycoons of the Gilded Age who have not been picked over, but Schiff had barely been. Schiff's been written about in journals. There have been books that have, of course, covered aspects of his life, but he has not been the subject of a major biography. And the reason, I think, there are two. One, Schiff didn't really seem to care if his name lived on. He was really about, in terms of his own philanthropy, which was massive, he was never terribly interested in attaching his name to his gifts. He did sometimes, but, and in terms of the name of his firm, he could have been Kuhn, Loeb, and Schiff, but that wasn't terribly important to him. But the other piece of it, I think, is that he was Jewish. And he was always, when people described him, he was always described as a Jewish banker. It wasn't like J.P. Morgan, the banker J.P. Morgan. It wasn't the Episcopalian banker J.P. Morgan. It was, the banker J.P. Morgan. And I think in part there was always sort of this asterisk next to his name and his legacy.
You think he kind of scared biographers away a little bit?
I don't know if he scared them away. I just think he was viewed as less consequential or less important than someone like J.P. Morgan, which I don't think is the case at all.
Got it. That's interesting. Maybe a question about you, sort of in context. Right? Your last book was about the Koch brothers. That was more of a book of journalism because the Koch brothers were alive as you were researching and writing the book. This is a book about Jacob Schiff, an influential financier, but from 100 years ago. Do you see like a through line in your own thinking or research that led you from one project to the next, or in general, if I can ask it in kind of a flip way, right? From whence comes your interest in the nexus of money and power?
I'm not terribly interested in money, and it's for the sake of money. I'm interested in money and the way that people use it to project power. And I'm interested in legacy. I'm interested in dynasty. I'm interested in the ways that people change the world. And so the Koch brothers, in their own way, have really changed the world in a number of ways, including ideologically. And one of the most rewarding parts of researching that book was really delving into their family background, and to understand why. Why was it important for Charles Koch to become a promoter of free market ideas? And I think these are quite separate topics, but the through line that runs through both of them is legacy, and that's where my interests lie.
Before we go any further, we've been talking about Jacob Schiff. So some people have a sense, because you heard kind of like a whisper through the crowd when you first mentioned his name. But for those who don't, just maybe the nutshell biography. Who is he? How did he come to America? How did he make it big? What's the thumbnail biography of Jacob Schiff?
So, Jacob Schiff, in my view, was the most important financier and philanthropist of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He came from Frankfurt, Germany, and unlike the Lehmans or the Seligmans or other families who I write about, who often came here as immigrants and peddled, and that's how they built their businesses, Schiff came from a fairly well-established family in Frankfurt. They were fairly well off. In fact, members of the Schiff family occupied one of the grandest homes in Frankfurt's Jewish Quarter, which was actually bought by Meyer Rothschild, the paterfamilias of the Rothschild banking family. So they were very entrenched there. Jacob Schiff, from the time he was young, really was sort of a bit rebellious, didn't get along well with his dad, and was just ravenously ambitious. He ends up coming to the United States, maybe not with the full permission of his parents, at the age of 18, right after the Civil War has ended, months after. Before he's 20, he started his own brokerage, and basically he partners with a couple of other young German Jewish fellows, and they're using their contacts back in Frankfurt to channel investment capital into railroads. So this is how he gets his start in the United States. He soon thereafter he marries into the Kuhn-Loeb banking family and sort of becomes the most important partner in this firm, which at that time was right up there with J.P. Morgan as the most important investment bank in the United States and globally. One of the most important globally, I should say. And he ends up really making his name on Wall Street by financing the railroads. His claim to fame was turning around the Union Pacific Railroad in 1900, and he partnered with Edward Harriman, and at a certain point they were, in control of probably a fifth of the nation's railroads. But there was another piece to his story, and he was also considered the leader of American Jewry during his lifetime, and just gave millions to a variety of causes that were really focused on the uplift of the Jewish immigrants that were pouring into this country.
These are 1920s millions.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Just for context.
Exactly. 1920s million. Yes. In fact, he died with a lot less money than a lot of people thought he would have had, and that was because he gave a lot of it away. Mm-hmm. But he was really the greatest Jewish philanthropist of his era, really out of that tradition of Moses Montefiore and those types of people.
In the title of the book, you talk about how these Jewish immigrants transformed Wall Street. This was an age of great financiers. Right? We've mentioned J.P. Morgan a few times, right? Vanderbilt and Carnegie and all these big industrialists were existing at the same time period. Was there a particular transformation or a particular contribution that the group that you were writing about, Schiff and his network, made that changed Wall Street, that was kind of different than everything else that was going on at that time?
I think that they were certainly participants in a lot of the major moves that were being made, major moves on Wall Street at that time. And of course, one of the most important parts of Schiff's financial legacy was the industrial transformation, the building up of the railroads in the United States and major industrial companies, but also the channeling of European investment capital into the United States in the hundreds of millions at that time, maybe billions, and really he helped to spur the transformation of the country into an economic superpower, which occurs after World War I. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, I mean, there's, the Federal Reserve might not exist if not for Paul Warburg, who was Schiff's partner and brother-in-law in Kuhn Loeb. He comes to the United States from Germany and, finds it to be sort of a financial backwater. We didn't have a central bank in the early 1900s. And so we were sort of careening from one financial crisis to the next because the currency system was inelastic. It did not expand or contract based on demand. So he becomes a major force in advocating for a central bank and is in the room when the Federal Reserve is created, and he's one of the drafters of it. So that's one thing. I mean, and then if you look at Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers. Henry Goldman and Philip Lehman, who were the scions of those firms, were childhood friends who decided to create a partnership to underwrite the type of businesses that were really not getting much attention by the major investment banks on Wall Street, which were much more focused on railroads, companies with a lot of physical assets, which is how the share prices were determined at that time. And really, they felt like there was a way to unlock a lot of value in these companies, and they took public companies like Woolworth, Sears, Studebaker, many others that would become iconic household name companies, and they helped these companies grow and thrive. So I mean, and then if you look at things like the progressive income tax, Edwin Seligman, who was the son of Joseph Seligman, a Columbia economist, he was the leading crusader for that amendment mm-hmm. that created the income tax, and so they really influenced our economic system in many ways.
Yeah. In its review of your book, the New York Times said, and I had the sense reading it also, so it was nice to see it in print, that it wasn't so much a book about bankers who happened to be Jewish. It was really a story of Jews who happened to be bankers. And I think we're getting a sense of that in the conversation about how these are really Jewish immigrant families and how they're all intertwined and there's a real sense of community. And the issues that they dealt with always touched on internal Jewish communal concerns as well. I'm wondering, did you mean to write a book that was about Jews who happened to be bankers? Or if you didn't, like at what point did the book kind of turn into that?
That's a good question. I read that line in that review and it sort of went, because to me, these guys didn't have a choice. There wasn't, you couldn't be, circling back to what I was saying in the beginning, it was always, Jacob Schiff is a German Jewish banker. He couldn't be a banker. He had to be a Jewish banker. And what's interesting about a lot of the characters in this book is that a lot of them drifted away from Judaism. They weren't terribly religious. Schiff was an exception to this. But at the same time, they were hugely concerned about the survival, not just the survival, but the fact that the Jewish people would thrive. So in addition to being active in finance, all of the major figures in this book, members of the Lehman family, the Goldman Sachs, Seligman's, were deeply involved in the philanthropy of that day, which was really head-spinning in its breadth, because they were funding schools, they were funding job training programs, they were funding refugee aid back in Europe, just a remarkable array of initiatives and organizations, and many of them actually still exist. I mentioned the AJC.
Right, this is the foundation of what we know today as the Jewish organizational world.
It's the bedrock of American Jewish life in America.
Right, and these are the men who built it.
Right, absolutely.
Or the families who built it.
No question.
So, at this point, we have to talk about anti-Semitism because it's been in the background of the conversation the whole way. And I noticed reading the book that there's really two types of anti-Semitism that Jacob Schiff and his network really encountered. Right, the first was that they were excluded from a lot of the corridors of power, a lot of the establishment, and they had to find their own way. Right, you spoke about how when Goldman Sachs first became a firm, they were looking for avenues and business opportunities that the established firms were ignoring, and that was where they found their role. So to a certain degree, they kind of bunched together, and they made choices because they really didn't have any place else to go. That's one side of things.
Right.
The other side of things is once they became successful, then you had Jacob Schiff, influencing international affairs by, deposing kings and funding sides of wars against other wars and puppeteering and the protocols and that whole thing on the other side. That's really coming from the other side. It's not keeping Jews out of power. It's complaining that Jews had too much power or Jews actually had all the power. And they were dealing with both of these at the same time, which is it's an evergreen kind of conversation because to a certain degree those two things are still true. But I'd like you to reflect on that, the way that Jacob Schiff and his generation dealt with those things.
Yeah, it's sort of fascinating. I mean, they were sort of blamed for collusion among Jewish bankers. Who were they supposed to collude with? Nobody else would collude with them. Sorry. As much as anything, this book is about the origins of anti-Semitism and where that comes from, especially
or American anti-Semitism.
American anti-Semitism, but also I think global anti-Semitism too, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But just going back historically, the reason why Jews ended up in financial roles was because oftentimes they were pushed into them. There were no other, they were not allowed to hold other jobs other than, tax collecting or peddling or money lending or those sorts of things. And historically, Jews were just despised even more for holding these roles that they had been pushed into. And when it comes to, the Gilded Age, there was a very firm separation on Wall Street between the Jewish banks and the Yankee banks. The thought that, Jacob Schiff could apply for a job at JP Morgan was absurd at that time. It wasn't going to happen. What made these firms powerful, what helped them to grow from the outset, was that they were built upon strong family networks that stretched back to Germany. For some of these families, this helped with the importation of all sorts of goods that helped their businesses grow. For Schiff, as I mentioned earlier, he was channeling German investment capital into the railroads.
It's almost ironic, because if Schiff had been able to get a job at J.P. Morgan, he would have become like a mid-level manager or maybe a vice president. He would have been very successful, and that would have been it. Yet, being forced to do something totally different that stretched back to his Jewish community in an ironic kind of way gave him the grounding, or maybe the resources, to become exceptional.
It's interesting, because the period of time that I write about was sort of the bridge between medieval anti-Semitism, blood libel type of stuff, and modern anti-Semitism, which is based on the Protocols of Zion, which came out in the 1903-1904 timeframe, around the time that Schiff is funding the Russo-Japanese War.
I'm wondering about, you, the author, like kind of looking at this historical context in terms of present day, right? So in a world where, the major boogeymen, money-wise, the Kochs nowadays not so much, because, Charles and David have both passed away and their networks exist. But when you're talking about like people, right? You're talking about, people blame George Soros, people blame the Adelsons, happen to be Jewish.
Right.
The people blame AIPAC for pumping, tens of millions of dollars into congressional races or primaries, or at least matching the money that's being raised in other places, nationalizing local races. I'm wondering if you've thought about kind of the episodes in your book and the way that Jacob Schiff and his team, or his generation, responded to the accusations that were being leveled against them. If there's any lessons or any correlation to very similar sounding things that we're seeing nowadays.
This is a really interesting episode, because right around the time that Henry Ford's paper launches this anti-Semitic campaign, Schiff it's 1919. Schiff dies in 1920. And he'd been so diligent about trying to stamp out anti-Semitism wherever he saw it throughout his life. And this one time he says, let's not, I think making a big deal about this is actually going to make it's going to be like pouring gasoline on the fire. What he didn't realize was that the fire had already been lit, and it would just keep burning for, a century on. So they didn't respond forcefully at first. Eventually, in that episode, litigation was what finally shut down the Dearborn Independent newspaper. And Louis Marshall basically brokered a statement with Henry Ford, who, apologized and, rescinded his comments. But he was, in reality, he was no less anti-Semitic than he had been at the outset. He just wanted the lawsuits to go away.
So when you kind of see nowadays, like, Jewish boogeymen and money in politics and these things kind of swirling around, do you get a feeling of deja vu having researched and read this book? I
see the code words everywhere. Mm-hmm. When you see someone talk about an international banker, it's just like, I know where that comes from. And what's scary is that, my theory about all this is that anti-Semitism at a certain point, and due to Henry Ford and others, just became sort of atmospheric. People are ingesting it without sort of knowing where this is coming from. So people might use the term international banker and not really know that it's freighted with a lot of stereotypes and has potential anti-Semitic connotations. But and you bring up someone like George Soros or the Adelsons. I think it's perfectly fine to criticize individuals for whatever you want, but it's when you depict Soros as a puppeteer of world events, where you're sort of feeding into these anti-Semitic stereotypes and myths that have been around for generations at this point.
Daniel Schulman, thank you so much.
Thank you.